Today, I'm going to attempt to answer the following question. Is there a such thing as a founder's brain? What motivated me to answer this question is that this semester I made two decisions that will invariably change my life. The first is that I married my partner of over 8 years. The second is that I decided to start a company full-time after HBS. In deciding to start a company, I found that many of the tools we've learned in Founder's Journey are helpful, but I found myself still looking for more answers to the questions of what does it take to be a founder and how can I assess myself against those traits to get a better sense of whether I quote unquote have what it takes. Which brings me to the next question. Do I have what it takes? More specifically, what is it that makes founders different such that we feel compelled to go on this irrational, quixotic journey? As I think about this question, I realize founders are not that different in that they are irrational. As we've learned, all humans, like all animals, are much more driven by emotion than reason in their decision making. So the real question is not what makes founders irrational, but what makes founders distinctly irrational compared to other humans. As it turns out, there's a fair amount of neurological and psychological research on this topic. There are some areas where there's less scientific consensus than others. For example, we still don't know quite what motivates entrepreneurs to become entrepreneurs, and the consensus seems to be, it depends. For instance, one study found that entrepreneurs who identify as men are much more motivated by money, while entrepreneurs who identify as women are much more motivated by their mission and by helping others. Another study found that entrepreneurs are motivated based on the salary that they could achieve elsewhere, and that those with higher earning alternatives are much more likely to put in additional effort and more additional effort into an entrepreneurial path than they were willing to put into their non-entrepreneurial path. However, there are still some areas in which there is more consensus on the distinctiveness in founder psychology. One interesting study shows that the greatest psychological differences between founders and non-founders are both their tolerance for financial risk and potentially less intuitively, their general self-confidence and belief that what they're doing will be successful, even if we know empirically this is likely less likely to be true than their non-entrepreneurial counterparts. We can see in the following chart where it shows that the number or proportion of founders are entrepreneurs in this chart, represented by the blue dots that enjoy financial risk, is much higher than the proportion of non-entrepreneurial employees at startups that enjoy financial risk as represented by the green triangles. Similarly, the founders' ratings of self-efficacy are much higher, represented by the blue dots, than their non-entrepreneurial or the joiner counterparts, represented by the green triangles. Which then leads us to the following question based on these findings, which seem to be pretty consistent in the literature. Is there such thing as a founder's brain? Neuroscientists have done a lot of research to try to understand the psychological underpinnings of self-confidence. And one conclusion is that the strength of neuronal connections in a part of brain known as the frontostriatal pathway was associated with stronger self-esteem. This was done in a study in 2014. More specifically, the anatomical strength of connections in this pathway was connected with long-term self-esteem, and the levels of activity in this pathway at any given point in time were associated with momentary bursts of self-esteem, as represented by results on an fMRI chart. Here we can see what the frontostriatal pathway looks like and where it's located in the brain. There are other interesting conclusions about the frontostriatal pathway in the neuroscientific literature. The first is that the frontostriatal pathway is an area of the brain whose increased levels of activation are involved in the prediction of risk-taking behavior. One study this past June found that increased activation in the frontostriatal pathway were associated with higher levels of risk-taking to seek out rewards, particularly in adolescence, and that these findings tended to stay true through adulthood for adolescents whose increased frontostriatal pathways were more active than their less active counterparts. This was all within the dopaminergic proportion of the frontostriatal pathway, which, as we learned in class, is responsible for reward systems. Another study, perhaps not surprisingly, also found that this increased activity was associated with psychological disorders such as alcohol and drug use disorders and depression. So, in conclusion, while I wasn't able to find research specifically on the frontostriatal pathway of entrepreneurs versus non-entrepreneurs, this certainly seems to be an area worth investigating, given that it seems as though the frontostriatal pathway is responsible for two of the most important distinctions psychologically between entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs, those being differences in appetite for risk and differences in self-confidence. This research could have interesting implications. For instance, if we're able to identify what a successful founder's brain looks like based on patterns in their frontostriatal pathways, that would raise questions such as, should prospective founders have their brain scanned to determine whether or not they should start a company? Or even, should VCs ask for fMRI results in due diligence to determine whether or not the founders are likely to be successful? One perhaps reassuring conclusion from this research is that those who aspire to be entrepreneurs but might not necessarily have the neuropsychological profile needed is that this connectivity in these areas is able to change over time, even though it's developed significantly during adolescence. Relatedly, Dr. Tara Stewart, who's a neuroscientist at MIT Sloan, has found that things such as healthy lifestyles and mindfulness practices can reduce adrenaline and cortisol levels on a long-term basis, and perhaps even make individuals more comfortable with taking healthy levels of risk than they previously were comfortable with. So for any of you aspiring entrepreneurs out there who feel that you don't necessarily have the right neuropsychology or don't have the right appetite for risk, you can actually train your brain to fix this. And that's all I have for today. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.